Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So I'm told that we can't have you see the slides and have the slides seen on the webcast at the same time. And so clearly a decision has been made here. Full disclosure, I am a psychologist, and my area of interest is risk and risk perception. So you may want to decide whether you want to sit next to me during lunch or not. I was invited to address the issue of how consumers make decisions. And I have to tell you that this is one of the hardest talks I've ever had to try to put together. At first, I thought I should just put up a slide that said, it's complicated, and then sit down. And then I thought, well, this is a group of scientists. I should go through the various theories that address how consumers make decisions. So go through the various economic theories, utility maximizing theories, and social science theories of dual processes. And I decided that that would make you decide that you wanted to kill yourself at the end of my talk. So that's not what I'm going to do. So my task is to try to figure out what I can tell you in 25 minutes that will be productive for the conversations during the rest of the couple of days, and this is what I've come up with. So I was asked several times, do you want to change your title? And and I couldn't even decide what to change my title to. So let me sort of take you through the thought process here. First of all, how do consumers make decisions? Well, decisions about what? About what kind of decisions? So there are different kinds of decisions that consumers have to face. Decisions about the veracity of different kinds of facts, so-called facts, or claims that are involved in the GM debate here. And I'm not sure whether you can see this. This is data to call out my colleagues, Kara Cute and Xenia Morin from Rutgers University. This is data we collected just before the election in 2013. It is 1,148 Americans selected from a GFK panel. The data is plus or minus 3%. And what I want you to pay attention to is the space between the green bars and the orange bars. So that's definitely true, likely false, definitely false, and I don't know is on third, okay? I actually thought about titling this talk, I don't know is on third. Hopefully some of you get that reference. I give that to my students, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. So there's a great deal of uncertainty. There's an inability of people to actually say whether it's true or false. So things like genetically modified crops are harmful to bees, which is the top line there. About 30% of Americans think that that is true, likely true, definitely true. But almost half have no idea whether that's true or not. They have an inability to detect whether that is a true fact or not. Eating genetically modified wheat has caused more people to become sensitive to gluten. That is an internet myth that's out there. And I try to explain to people that there is no genetically modified wheat, and they have a problem when I try to present facts. That seems irrelevant. A large fast food company used chicken so altered by genetic modification that they can't be called chicken anymore. This was an internet rumor about Kentucky Fried Chicken. They changed their name to KFC. And there was a widely disseminated rumor that they went to KFC because they couldn't call it chicken anymore. And of course, they changed their name to take the word fried out. Again, people don't have what they need to reject that as a false fact. Eating genetically modified foods has caused an increase in cancer. About 1 in 4 Americans think that that's true or likely true, and the majority just can't even tell you whether it's true or false. So one kind of a decision is about whether the facts are true that they are faced with. So that's one kind of decision. Another kind of decision is an evaluative decision involving the costs or risks and benefits of the technology in the abstract, which is difficult enough for people. They don't quite understand how the science works. If you look at the mental models that people have of GM, even what GMO means. I'm sure you've all seen the Jimmy Kimmel scene where he goes out to the farmer's market and asks people what GMO means, and most of them don't know what it means, but they do know that they're against it. So, is the technology positive or negative overall, or are there particular applications of biotechnology that are likely to be beneficial. Data from the same survey, and again, I know you probably can't read this at all, but what I want to point out is on the bottom row, there is a hierarchy of approval. People tend to think more kindly of plant-based GMOs than animal-based GMOs. Again, this is strongly approve, somewhat disapprove, strongly disapprove, unsure, and I don't know. Essentially, I don't know is on third again here. So there's this hierarchy of approval. People seem to be more amenable to the idea of GMO plants than GM animals. But even in the same survey, many of the people who say that they are not, would not entertain the use of GM to create new kinds of plants are in favor, very much in favor, for example, of trees that can clean chemically contaminated water. So if that's what you mean by GMO, well, I'm good with that. Or more nutritious grain to feed people in poor countries. Well, if that's what you mean, well, I'm in favor of that. You know, sweet corn that reduces the use of the need to spray pesticides. Well, if that's what you mean, well, I'm in favor of that. So there's a difference between making decisions about the technology simply in the abstract, where the focus is really on the science and the ethics of the science and and how the science works versus the particular applications. People understand problem solving. They understand that this is a problem worth solving, and so maybe it's a problem worth solving through biotechnology. All right? There are also evaluative decisions involving specific kinds of values. So an assessment of whether the technology is consistent with my particular values or my worldview. Are there potential costs and benefits of a specific application consistent with my values? Do the people involved, the companies involved, do they share my values? Do they share my worldview? Do they share my ideology? So that's a different kind of decision altogether. There are also behavioral decisions. Should I vote in this referendum in GMO labeling? Should I buy this product because it says it's GMO free? You know, should I put on this costume depicting a giant ear of corn and march, you know, with a sign in front of my local supermarket? Those are taking actions. That's a different kind of decision than figuring out whether I like something or not. So, so there are different kinds of decisions and somewhat similar processes in reaching those decisions, but with different consequences. So there are some different kinds of guides to decision making. We talked about worldview a bit, and my colleagues throughout the next 2 days will be talking about some of these biases, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on them. But one of the things we certainly see in GMOs, we've seen it, I've been doing this for more than 20 years, is the naturalness bias. So what's really interesting to me as a psychologist is that people seem to think that nature or God or Gaia or Thor or whatever their sort of deity is, that somehow that he or she is the great regulator, that somehow even people who don't actually believe in evolution somehow believe that these kinds of things have been evolved or created, they belong together, and we shouldn't screw around with them. That people are, in fact, fallible. Scientists are fallible. If it's not natural, it's therefore not good. And we see marketers using the naturalness claim over and over and over again. There's a big debate at the FDA over how to define natural. Thus far, they've declined to actually provide a definition. So this idea of natural and GMOs is an issue. Social comparisons and norms. So one of the things we try to do is to look around us and ask, well, what decisions have other people made? That's a shortcut to trying to figure out what I should think or what I should do. And in fact, one of the reasons we look at what other people have done is to figure out whether, if my decision is consistent with theirs or is different than theirs, what does that actually say about me? So part of this is about self-presentation, not simply about trying to find the truth. So that sort of brings me to the subtext here, which is, well, you're not really interested in how people make decisions. What you want to really know is, can the public reach the right decisions about GMOs? And this sort of gets to one of the things that Dietram was talking about this morning. And my answer really is yes, but it sort of depends on what your definition of right is. Public perceptions, we know, are quite different than expert scientific perceptions of GMOs, and so that their decisions are unlikely to be the same as the expert decisions. And this poses something of a problem. You know, when we find out, just as normal human beings, when we find out that people's decisions are different than our own, we immediately go to motivation, or we go to competence. So there's a basic social psychology behind this. We generally overestimate how representative our knowledge and our beliefs actually are of the population. So we think that everybody should know or does know the same things we do, or everyone should share the same values as we do. And if they share the same values and they know many of the same things that we do, then they should reach the same conclusions that we do. And when we find that they don't reach the same conclusions, we immediately question what's wrong with them, because obviously we're right. This is a human problem. It's not just a scientific problem, but I would say that it is reinforced in science. Because when you think about the scientific method and how we proceed through science, you know, we lay out our assumptions, we lay out our data. We should all come to the same conclusions if the assumptions and the data are correct. If we don't agree on the conclusions, we re-examine the assumptions and the data and figure out where we disagree. That doesn't happen in the real world, in the natural world that's out there. So when we find that people don't agree with us, we tend to question their competence or their motivations. And so one of the things I often hear from my science colleagues is that the public certainly is just irrational. But I want to assure you that the public is not irrational. They actually do have bases for their decisions. They're just different than the ones that natural scientists have. So that raises the question of, all right, so well, how do we have a conversation about GMOs? And I want to talk about the 3 filters of reality plus 1. So this comes from a chapter in a book by Garrett Hardin back in 1985. His 3 filters of reality were literacy, numeracy, and ecolacy. I've added graphicacy to this. And essentially, literacy is the ability to understand words and stories, not just the ability to read, but the ability to take meaning from words and stories. Graphic is the ability to understand graphical information. Numeracy is the ability to understand numbers. And most importantly, ecolacy is skill in understanding complex relationships. So literacy is the way that normal people learn and communicate. It's the way we talk with one another outside of science. We learn through stories, through anecdotes, metaphors, examples, these kinds of things. But it's really clear that these kinds of stories and the ability to take meaning from them are culturally specific. So we have different kinds of myths, different kinds of reference points, and those work within our own particular cultures, but not necessarily on the outside. Graphicacy is the ability to actually learn through visual communication, through things like sketches, photographs, diagrams, maps, those kinds of things. I also want to point out that those interpretations are often culturally constrained as well. So can you see the bottle here? Can you see what's on it? There's a skull and crossbones. What does that mean? How do you know that? Well, yeah, you can read the label, assuming you couldn't read the word poison. How do you know that skull and crossbones actually represents danger? Is there anything intrinsic in that? I would say the answer is no, and empirically the answer is no. We know from child poisoning studies. In fact, when I first showed this picture to my daughter when she was about 6, she said, "Oh, Daddy, that's what pirates drink." Right? So even pictures are culturally constrained. The meaning that people take from these kinds of image isn't necessarily intrinsic. Numeracy. It's essential to what we all do. Unfortunately, we know that the public struggles with mathematical concepts. Most people, at least in the United States, have a very difficult time with very large and very small numbers. Fractions, proportions, percentages, probabilities. It explains why people play the lottery. So the problem here is, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in the next couple of days, is that we as scientists communicate using numbers. Non-scientists and most journalists communicate using words, stories, and sometimes pictures. This creates a communications barrier, and it even actually represents a communication barrier between different subdisciplines in science. So I attempt to read science. I'm an experimental psychologist. I am quite empirical, but frankly, there are some things in the journal I just have to read the introduction and read the conclusions and assume, well, it was in science, it therefore must be true, because I can't quite understand, how the analysis was done or the mathematics. Finally, and most importantly, there is this issue of ecolacy, and it's the ability to see the big picture. It's the capacity to envision both the intended and unintended consequences of a decision or action. It is literally the ability to see the forest and the trees. What we want to try and get to is this idea of ecolacy, both among ourselves, both within the scientific community, but also with the public itself. So here's the kicker. You can be enormously literate. You can be quite numerate. You can figure out maps and graphs. But the sum of those things doesn't necessarily lead to this ecolacy idea. As I say here, we all know people who are extraordinarily brilliant, but they're so focused on the details, so focused on the facts, that they can't actually see the big picture. In common parlance, we say they lack common sense. Maybe that goes too far. But just because you know a string of facts doesn't give you the ability to put them together necessarily to see the whole. So as I say here, seeing the big picture isn't simply a matter of observing all of the details. Often to grasp the details, you need the context of the big picture. So one of the reasons I have the picture of the chess folks here, well, is anybody a chess player here? Anybody good at it, are you? So what's the difference between an excellent chess player, a grand master, and hacks like me? Well, I'm sure there are lots of differences. What's the difference in the way they play? Okay, so for me, I look at the board and I think, okay, the little horsey guy goes 2 up and 1 over, right? And then I look at the opposite player's move, and then I think, okay, well, then I'm going to move my pawn. So the difference between my playing as a hack is I'm focused on the individual pieces. A grand master looks at the entire board and sees patterns on the board and recognizes my moves as part of a particular pattern. Oh, that's the Smirnoff opening. So I'm going to employ the pop-off defense, right? Those are the only 2 Russian vodkas I know. But the idea here is that he or she is looking at patterns, and that actually helps them see anomalies in the pieces, which then helps them plan their next move, whereas a hack is actually trying to figure out the entire board by looking at the individual pieces. It's the difference between the big picture, seeing the forest, and me looking at the trees making up the forest. So here's the reinforcement of what my colleague had to say this morning. Educating people about the scientific details doesn't necessarily lead to greater comprehension of the big picture or the ability to make informed decisions. We can't simply cram more facts in, expecting a good decision to come out in the end. All right. 2 components in decision making, and we'll hear more about this. There are cognitive components, thoughts, understanding of the likely consequences, mental models of how GMOs work, the understanding of the context involved, and then there are affective components. They are the feeling pieces of this. Many psychologists, and especially economists, the behavioral economists, believe that affect is a byproduct of cognition. That is, people evaluate the information first, which then leads to an overall emotional reaction. However, it's pretty clear from the psychology that people have a remarkably poor understanding of what influences their own perceptions and behaviors. They can't say why they feel the way they do, why they've made a particular choice, why they act the way they do. In fact, they have a remarkably poor ability to predict what will actually make them happy in the future. So this idea that cognition comes first and then affect later, I think is a problem. It seems clear that affect can in fact also drive future cognition. We know, for example, that first impressions matter. When we try to sell a house, curb appeal matters. We want people to have a good first impression because they can then ignore how lousy the kitchen is. We also engage in cyclical thinking. You know, I like it because it's good, and it's good because I like it. There is no reason there. It's just, I think it's good, right? So sometimes affect can come first. It isn't always really the byproduct of cognition. All right, so let me present just a little bit more data before I run out of time. Again, this is data from the survey that Dr. Cute and Morin and I collected in 2013, and we began focusing on GM foods. We asked, how would you rate your own basic understanding of how food is grown and produced? Ladies and gentlemen, only 22% of the American population believes that their knowledge of how food is grown and produced in this country is fair or poor. If you then ask them a series of questions, factual questions, it's pretty clear they have no idea what they're talking about. And what's even more amazing about this is that people who live in cities think they know more than people who live in rural areas where food is actually grown and produced. So they tend to overestimate what they know. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you don't know what you don't know, you're unlikely to ask questions. It's a little Rumsfeldian. There are no knowns. Yeah, right. So if you don't know what you don't know, you're unlikely to seek education to fill in gaps in your knowledge that you're not aware of. We asked, before this survey, were you aware that genetically modified foods existed? 25% of the population said, no. 25, 1 in 4 Americans have no idea that GM foods even exist. That's important if you actually look at survey data. Many survey analysts would then say, okay, fine, if you don't know anything about this, you can't be part of our survey anymore. How you ask the question and of whom you ask the questions matters a great deal. We asked, how much have you heard or read about GM foods? 50% say very little or nothing at all. So half the population has heard or read very little. How much do you know? Self-assessed knowledge. 55%, very little or nothing at all. So 25% have never heard of it. 50% say they've heard little or nothing. 55% say they know very little or nothing at all. We asked, how often have you ever had a conversation about this? This is a measure of engagement. 66%, 2/3, say, I've never had a conversation about GMOs with anyone ever in my entire life. Only 3% say they've had a frequent conversation. 18% occasionally, 11% very rarely. As far as you know, are there any foods containing GM ingredients in supermarkets right now? 57% say no, they don't know, or were unable to answer or refuse to answer the question. So only 43% know that there are GM foods in supermarkets. We asked the people who thought that there were GM foods in supermarkets, well, what do you think is there? And I'm not sure you can read this, but I've conveniently coded it in red and green. Green are the ones that are potentially there, like corn, soybeans, soy, canola oil, squash, sugar, and papaya, although it's really unlikely that you'd see a GM papaya in the continental US. And in red, we have things like tomatoes, wheat, chicken, apples, rice, salmon, and oranges. So 56% of those who think there are foods with GM ingredients in the supermarkets believe that there are GM tomatoes there. There were in 1996, withdrawn in 1997, but people, I think, look at the perfect hothouse tomatoes and must assume that they are GM. You know, 50% think there's GM chicken in the supermarket. There's not. 55% think there's GM wheat out there. There is not. So people are confused, even when they think there are GM products, they're not really sure which ones are actually there. Have you ever eaten a GM food? Only about 1 in 4 people say yes. We're all eating GM foods. Most of the commodity crops, corn, soy, canola, are of GM varieties, and so most of the processed foods, unless it specifically says is GMO-free, is likely to contain 1 or more GM ingredients. So what we're showing is that people say they haven't heard very much, they don't know very much, they've never talked about this, they're unaware they're eating it, and yet they have an opinion. and they're willing to express it, right? So we asked, knowing this because I've been doing this for 20 years, would you say your opinion of genetically modified food is based on a general feeling or specific issues? And our colleagues at GFK said, you can't ask that question, no one's going to answer it. No one's going to tell you it's just their gut. And what we found was 50% said it's essentially based on truthiness, right? Stephen Colbert? 50% said it's just a general feeling I have about it, which makes sense if you don't know very much, you haven't read very much, you haven't talked very much about this. What do you have left, right? 34% were willing to admit that there is something in particular, but it's also gut. Only 15% said that it was a specific issue that was really driving their opinion, both positive and negative opinions about this. So here's one of the bottom lines. Being uninformed does not stand in the way of having an opinion. Okay? So the number of people who say they approve or disapprove of the technology typically exceeds the number of people who report knowing much about it. I will also note that being uninformed doesn't stand in the way of voting or serving in Congress. The key thing is that relatively uninformed opinions are uncrystallized, right? Those opinions, though, are not well thought through, they're not strongly held, they're subject to change, they're influenced by the wording of questions, but they're still important. Just because people don't have a lot of facts behind their opinions doesn't invalidate their opinions, because they're able to make decisions, they do make the decisions, and they act on those decisions. So they're important. The context here is that biotech is still an abstract concept for many people, I would say most people. It's actually not been high on the issue agenda for most people. Most people are still not thinking about this, despite all the ballot initiatives in the last several years. It's not something about which people have been forced to make personal decisions. And that's important because we know from social psychology, once people make a decision, their opinions, in fact, become a lot more crystallized. They adjust their attitudes and opinions to support their decisions. As Dietram was saying, we are cognitive misers. I would argue we are cognitively lazy. I think that was sort of a nice way of putting it. Reframed. Reframed. So what we tend to do is to pay attention to confirming information. We discount inconsistent information, and more maddeningly, we reinterpret disconfirming information to support the decision. It's the exception that proves the rule. And you'll hear more about this kind of confirmation bias in other talks. So finally, there's the issue of motivation and ability. I've already shown you that people don't have a lot of factual information to use to make decisions. Are they highly motivated to think carefully through information and to form an argument that's based on evidence? Or are they merely thinking superficially and using shortcuts, heuristics, which you'll probably hear more about as well, to reach very quick conclusions? So here's the challenge. What would it take to get people to move from largely using intuition to make decisions about biotechnology to a position where they could elucidate arguments based on evidence? Moreover, is that really our goal? Should that be our goal? And how do we do that while also helping people consider not just biotechnology in terms of evidence, but also things like nanotech and synthetic bio and cloning and climate change and geoengineering and deep sea exploration and all of the other scientific issues about which there are workshops in this very room? We all want the same goal. How do we get the public to think about all of these things at the same time? And then finally, it's pretty clear to me that an adverse event involving biotech would likely serve as a pivot point in marketing parlance that would quickly catalyze public opinion and decision making. In other words, if something goes horribly wrong with a biotech application, that's going to provide motivation for people to think carefully about it. Are there any positive developments that would likely have the same effect? And I'm going to leave you with that to discuss during the break. How am I on time?
Almost perfect. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
This slightly over, but I still want to make sure that Bill gets at least one or two questions, if there are any, before we go into the nicely labeled mingle and discuss.
Yes, ma'am.
I was struck by the fact that...
Oh, could you use the microphone, please?
Cynthia Bell from Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. This was a very interesting pair of papers, and I was struck by I was expecting the psychologist to have interviewed people. Neither one of you seems to have sat down and talked.
Well, of course we have.
Well, let's hear about it.
Well, I only had 25 minutes to talk.
Okay.
So of course I've interviewed people, and you know, one of the things as a psychologist, one of the things I do is association tasks. So what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say the word GMO or biotechnology or genetic engineering? And what we find is that what you call the technology matters a great deal. So, and I'm very interested in the first responses when you categorize those things. You know, are they talking about specific objects? Are they talking about particular products? Or is this kind of affective response? And when you use the word agricultural biotechnology, which is what the FDA would all like us to use when we discuss this, we find that that's the most sort of neutral, that evokes the most neutral images. So people come up with things like, well, actually, like the Wordle that Dietram showed. So white men in white coats holding Erlenmeyer flasks, and you know, the double helix and those kinds of things. If you present them with genetic engineering or genetic modification, you get many more negative kind of utterances. So things like, ooh, monster, mutant, nasty, you know, those kinds of things. So of course we've interviewed people. I've done mental modeling interviews, one-on-one interviews. We've done focus groups on labeling. We'll talk about that later this afternoon to see how consumers think about this as a precursor often to the kind of survey research that we do to try to triangulate how people actually think about these things. How's that?
One more question. If you could come up to the microphone, please.
J.D. Hansen with the International Center for Technology Assessment, and I've looked at both the genetically modified foods side of biotechnology, but also the human applications of it. Has your survey data looked at biotechnology and public attitudes related to the human biotech applications, and then also on science, have you looked at the opinions of scientists that aren't necessarily bioengineers, and does the scientific community's views and knowledge differ very much from the general public if it's not their main area?
So I think that's a question to both of us, actually. So I can say that my survey research has not looked at other scientists. I'm primarily interested in the population, in the general population, in the normal population, not scientists. And there is a difference in terms of public opinions about particular applications. I do work on public perceptions of nanotechnology and lots of other things as well. And there's something about food that just makes it very, very different than any other application that's out there. And it's not hard to come up with reasons, why. Food is something we obviously take in internally, but it also has a lot of symbolic value. We use food to build relationships with one another. See, the psychologist mentioned relationships. Good. It stands for nurturing, it stands for health, it stands for lots of other things. We have this heuristic of disgust, and we talk about the yuck factor with GM foods. That's another sort of shortcut. So there is something about food that is very different, even than things like medicines, which are also taken internally, but which are meant to have kind of magical properties. The framing of that, the way that we think about that, and the things that medicine represents are just very different than food. And both of those applications are very different from environmental applications, for example. So it's a different set of things that seem to drive people's decision-making about these.
We
Okay.
probably have to leave it at that, and just if I can take the microphone for the webcast really quickly. Thank you one more time, Bill. We'll take a quick break. As I said, the mingle and discuss wherever you'd like to do that. We'll be back at 5 off, so at 10:25, please, and we're going to start back up. So for those of you on the webcast, we'll have about a 10-minute break from now on. Thank you so much.